Hello and welcome to Django DRF Query Fundamentals course. My name is Xander. Now this tutorial is part of a whole course playlist available for free on YouTube. If you do like this course and you want to delve deeper, the full course is available for purchase at Udemy. Again, find all the resources and links in this video's description. Do remember to subscribe to the channel for weekly promotions, discounts, and of course Udemy course giveaways. I had originally in the previous tutorial planned to move deeper into serialization and to look at the inner workings of Django serializers. But as it turns out, there's just a lot of moving parts when we try to initially learn from a one-to-many relationship. So here is a great opportunity in this tutorial for us to move a little bit deeper into serializers and for us to maybe demystify the workflow a little bit further in terms of what exactly happens when a client sends a request to our API and how we then manage it through the serializer and the view sets. Right, so if you remember, we have a products table and a stock management table. So in this tutorial, we're going to learn how the client can send data for both product and stock management in the same request. And we're going to learn how we can then manage that data to, in actual fact, save data into the product and stock management in one operation. Now, the techniques that we learn in this tutorial, you can also apply them to one-to-many relationships. But generally, with one-to-many relationships, you have that additional task of checking to see if the actual category exists or not. Because remember, when we add a product, it needs to be connected to a category, but that category could already exist. Whereas with products and stock management, there is a one-to-one relationship. So if we add a new product, there will never be a stock management record already existing. So we would have to mandatorily always create that stock record. And it's that detail that just makes this whole process a lot easier to understand, at least initially, as we start to learn the inner workings of serializers. Okay, so the plan is now then to create some sort of endpoint, which we can then allow the client to send both the stock management information, data, as well as the product data. And then with that request from the client, we need to save the new product in the product table and then save the stock management data in the stock management table. Now to do that, we're going to use nested serializers. Now I have already shown you a dodgy diagram of the API request cycle, but let's just go through a quick recap. The client is going to send a request to the API, let's say a post request in this case, and inside of that post request are additional information which our API needs to route to our different endpoints here that we are creating. Now let's imagine the client has sent a post request to this endpoint here, and it is a post request, so therefore it's going to be channeled to this create function here in our view set. Right, so we now have the client's request. We pass that into our create function, and then we can go ahead with that data. We can go ahead and then pass it through our serializer. So the whole point of this serializer is it's going to take the client's data that they are sending to our API endpoint. It's going to be matched against these fields, which correspond to the product table. That's where the client's data is going to be saved to. And then it's going to be serialized, converted it into some sort of object that our application can then support and use to save to the database. Right, so at this point, our data has been serialized. So we use serializer, at that point we initiate serializer is valid to see if the data is serializing correctly. If it is valid data, to make sure that all the data that has been sent via the client matches the expectations. And then if it does, we can go ahead and then run serializer.save. Now, in actual fact, when we run serializer.save, it will trigger the create method in the serializer. So here in Django DRF, validation and creation are closely tied within the ViewSets create method. The final step, of course, is that if the data has been saved successfully, we send that data back to the client, and that's optional. We have been doing that on every single example, but that definitely is an optional activity. So sometimes you want to send some data back to the client. Maybe they need to perform some other operations or show something to the or within the application, or perform some additional task to confirm to the maybe user that the data has been saved and what data has been saved to the database. Okay, so you can pause it here, but I've broken that down into this table, and you can see that's exactly what I've just explained here, but with some additional information related to the functions or methods that is used within the serializer or the view sets to help you better understand the exacts of how you might start to think about overriding this process that I've just described. Take, for example, when we initially take the client's data and serialize it. In actual fact, within our serializer, here in step 3, you can see we utilize within the serializer the toInterval value method in the serializer. So if we were concerned with making customizations related to the validation and converting of that client data into our Python dictionary, then we would need to override the toInternal value method in our serializer. And that's where we're leading to here, overriding methods in the serializer. And this is a nice list of the different serializer methods in DRF for our serializer. And this is going to get you deeper into the customization of serializers. So if you wanted to customize how, for example, model instances are serialized or outputted, then we would need to think about overriding the toRepresentation method in our serializer. And that's what we're going to be doing and showing you in this tutorial. But we also will need to make an override, I think, on the create method. So this defines how to create new model instances. So in this case, we're going to save into the product and in the stock management table. So we're going to make an override in the create method in our serializer to perform that operation. Right, so let's get started. Remember, the goal here is to allow the client to send both the product and the stock information in one request, as if they were going to actually build a new product, or the application or whatever is going to be building a new product. It's going to send that data to the API, and we're going to create both the product and populate the stock management table. Right, so in actual fact, we can just copy and paste the previous endpoint in our views. We'll utilize that. Let's call this product stock insert view set. Okay, let's call this number 8 to insert a product and its stock record or its stock data. Okay, so the data gets passed in, request, and then we create a product and stock record. So we're going to use a different serializer. Oh, actually, we're going to use a create product. Let's use the create product, stock. Let's call this create product stock serializer. So that's going to be the serializer that we're going to utilize. So let me just, apologies, that never looks good. Okay, so we're going to do that. So we bring that in. Let's go back down to the view set. Let's go back into the serializer. All right, so we're going to, I think we used this in the previous. So let's make a copy of this. Okay, so this is going to be called create product stock serializer. Okay. Right, so the current setup here, the client can send information to save into the product table. This is the data points, the data that we are expecting to serialize to be able to then create the object to save into the database through the Django ORM. Okay, so what we want to allow is the client to send some additional information. And that additional information is some stock information. So we're going to add an additional field here. Now this field doesn't exist on the product table, but this is a field we want to serialize from the data that's sent by the client. So we're going to add stock, let's just call this stock data. Right, now because these fields are connected to a product, they will be successfully serialized because of all the information that we have in the product model. It allows the serializer to identify the data types, everything that's needed in order to serialize this data. But of course, it knows nothing about this stock data. So what we need to do here is we need to tell Django that this data here will be, you'll be able to serialize it from this additional information that we provide you. So this is where we can bring in a nested serializer. So I use the same name as the new field that we've added, and now I can connect that to an additional serializer. So this is going to be the stock management serializer. Now I have already created that up here. So I've created this new serializer, stock management serializer, from the stock management table, and I've just included the quantity field for now. There are some additional fields you might want to add, but generally they are automatically created by the database system. For example, the primary ID, the date that the stock was last updated, that can also be generated automatically. So really what was left is the quantity field. So you can view the models if you want to. Well, let's just have a look. So last checked at, so that can happen automatically. And then we have quantity. The default is 0, so we didn't actually need to supply that, but we ought to supply some sort of quantity. And then you can see that we then have the one-to-one field over to the product table. Okay, so that isn't needed to be supplied by the client data, so we don't need to worry about that. So what we end up with is that typically the client might want to supply the quantity of the product that exists. And now at this point, there are around about 18 different field arguments for this serializer and serializers in general. So there's quite a lot to learn here, and I'm only showing you just some of the more predominant serializers, but you can ask your AI coding partner to produce you a lovely list of different arguments for your serializer. So in this tutorial, we're going to have a look at, for example, required. So we want to make sure that in actual fact, because we have a one-to-one relationship between product and the stock management table, there must always be a stock management record for each product. So in actual fact, we're going to force the requirement of this data to exist if a new product is created. So we're going to use required and set that to true. And then we got some key options here, write only and read only. So what we are ultimately deciding here is, do we want to allow this serializer to be used for saving data, i.e. the client sends data, data gets saved, or do we simply want to utilize this serializer to show data to the client? So deserialize the data, or to serialize the data before we then move it to the client the other way. Or potentially we might want both. We might want to be able to save the data, serialize and save the data, and then from the database serialize that in preparation for then to send to the client. So we've got a lot of options here, and it will depend on your particular requirements, whether you need to send data back to the client or whether you're simply saving data from the client. Right, so let's start with write only equals true, and then let's go for required equals true. So we're going to use this serializer simply for extracting or serializing the data from the client and then saving it to the database. That's the current setup. And of course, it's going to be a required field or data from the client. Right, so we now have in the view an endpoint, which is obviously connected to our serializer. And we have our new serializer, which is going to allow the client to send some additional information, the stock data. So let's take a look at this in action first. So I'll bring up all the containers if you haven't already done so. Okay, so go ahead and refresh the page. We should now have an endpoint product stock insert. Now from here we can try this out. All right, so let's make sure we add in a unique name for the name of the product. At this point, I do have a database full of example products from previous tutorials. I haven't reset it. You may like to do that. So let's add this to category 1, which exists. Again, if you don't have a category, just go ahead and add a category so that you can get this working. So just insert a new category with this endpoint. Right, so this is category 1. So I'll go ahead and execute. So that's not going to work because remember, now we have that additional field, stock data. So we're going to need to add that additional information to the request body data. Okay, so I've made some changes. I've zoomed in. Hopefully you can better see this now. So I've made up a new name to make sure that the name of the product is unique. But this time you can see I've added the stock and I've added the quantity. Remember, that was the expected field from the stock management serializer. That's what it's expecting, just quantity in this case. So I'll go ahead and execute. And now we have a bad request. So product with slug exists. This category field required, so we're going to need to make some changes, and the stock data, this field is required also. So it looks like we still got a potential issue here. So let's change the slug name to make sure it's unique. We're obviously going to need the category. We can connect the product to a category. So let's connect that to category 1. So let's give this a go. So this should be called stock data, apologies. So a few errors there. Execute. Okay, so now we've got an error here. Okay, so we're told here we have a type error when calling product.objects_create. This may be because you have a writable field on the serializer class that is not a valid argument to product object create. So you need to make sure that the field read only. You need to make the field read only or override the create product stock serializer create method to handle this correctly. Okay, so what we're being told here is that the data is being passed into our create function. We go ahead and validate that data. Looks like it's validating correctly because remember we are defining this stock data based upon the serializer, this nested serializer, so that's all good. So this is all being validated against the product model, sorry. Happy days. And when we go ahead and save, what's happening is that we're trying to save that data, including this stock management record, into the product database, into the product table, sorry. And of course, the product table doesn't support stock data, so it doesn't know what to do with that data. So we're told that we either change this to read only so that then this data point here, this field would just be used for read only. So for passing data back to the client, in which case it won't be used for saving data, in which case this could potentially work, the rest of the data. Or else we're told that we're going to need to make a customization of how the data is saved, and we're going to do exactly that. So we're now going to override how our serializer saves data. We're going to extract the stock data. We're going to save the product data into the product table, extract the stock data, and save that into the stock management table. So at this point, all I need to do is go back. I say all I need to do. What I need to do is go back to my serializer methods and have a look to see which methods I need to override. And it looks like we have a create method here that is used to define how to create new model instances. So the third one from the top, create, define how to create new model instances. So that's what I need to override related to saving objects in the database. Right, so let's not mix this up with the ViewSet, the create method on the ViewSet. In many respects, the create method on the ViewSet is nothing to do with the create method in the serializer. It just happens to have the same name at this point. So here we have our create method. What we're doing is we're passing in validated data. Because what's happening here is that the data comes into our function. We validate it initially, and then if the data is validated, we then go ahead and save. So when this save function is called on the serializer, in actual fact, that is calling the create function here. So the validated data is passed in. We perform our operations, in this case, to save to the product table and the stock management table. Right, so what we first do is use a validated data pop. So this is a method of extracting data from the client's data that was sent. In this case, we want to extract the stock data. So that purely is a reference to this data here, this nested data here. So we're simply going to extract, we're going to remove that from the data that's sent by the client, and then we're going to work with that data separately. So using pop is going to allow us to do that. So behind the scenes in my mind, that data no longer exists in the validated data. That data only exists in this new variable here, stock data. We can then utilize that to save to the stock management table. So because we've extracted that data now from the validated data, it means it no longer exists, which means we can now successfully use product.objects.create, create being the method used to save data into the database table, in this case, the product table. So we now have saved the product data, and what is left is the stock data that we've extracted from the original validated data. So we then go ahead, perform the same operation on the stock management table using the object manager. We use the create function to actually create a new record, and we pass in this case the product. So this is a reference to the product where we want to actually create a relationship with. Now remember, here in the model, product was our one-to-one field. So what we're doing here, like I said, is we're passing in our product that has just been created, our new product, and from there we're able to reference it directly within our query to actually build that connection between the stock management record and the product. So what essentially gets added here is the primary key of the product that was just created. And then we unpack and utilize the stock data that was passed in by the client to fill in the rest of the fields, which in this case is just the quantity field. Right, so let's see this in action. So I haven't changed the previous request here, so I'm going to, I think, keep that the same. Let's see if they give this a go. So I execute again, and this time you can see we get a response body. And that response doesn't include currently the stock details. It just includes the product details that have now been created and stored in our database. Now remember, that was expected because remember here we have write only true, which means that we didn't want to include that stock data in the data that was sent back to the client. And remember here we are using in the responses the create product serializer. And that's a good point. We need to probably change that because we copied and pasted that from the previous, didn't we? So we want to actually use the create product serializer for the request and the response. Apologies. By doing that, in actual fact, it's going to update the front end. I've made a mistake there. I won't go back on it, but let's just quickly try that. So I've updated the request and response to now represent the actual serializer we're using, and that should also now update the front end. So let's do a refresh on the front end. Go back to our products.insert, and we should now have, yes, apologies. So we now do have the stock data automatically created here for us as an example. So we don't have to manually add that. Now we can use that template. So let's just try this one more time then. Make sure you don't have more than 50 characters here, remember. And give it a category, a stock quantity, execute. Okay, so it does look like it's still working. And now at this point, we haven't covered selecting or querying the data and returning data from the database. So the only way for us to really view this in the database is to quickly inspect it from our Docker container. Right, so head over to your containers, go to your database, open up exec, your terminal. Let's log in. So PSQL, capital U, and then Postgres, the name of the user, and then small d, and then the table, the database, sorry, inventory. Okay, so let's go ahead and select all. Let's select all from inventory underscore products. That's our table, products table. Have I done something wrong here? Inventory product, or maybe it's just product. Yep. So inventory product table, and you can see I have a number of different products here. The last entered was product number 8. Okay, so just remind ourselves of that. So this is what we're looking at here. It's not very easy to see this, but up the top here it shows you all of the different fields, and this has obviously been compressed slightly, but this first number represents the ID, the primary key of the record. So the last record was number 8. So let's go into the stock management table. And that should show a record for that. Okay. No. Inventory stock management. Is it one word? Yes. Okay. So you can see the last entry here we added into the stock management table was product ID number 8. And there we go. So we have the corresponding stock record and product inserted into our tables. So that confirms that the code is working to a certain degree, but the question now is, what if we wanted to actually return the stock data? So at the moment, we're using this for write only, but we also now want to send this back with the product data when we return the data back to the client. So let's remove that write only option now, and let's give this a go. So if we go back to our endpoints, reset that. Let's add in category 1. Let's change the name and slug. I think that should do it. Let's execute, and we should have an error. So now we're told that we've got an attribute error when attempting to get the field for stock data on the serializer. So what's happening here is that when we try and send the data back to the user, we're serializing the data, but we don't know anything about the stock data field. Now, this is partly due to the fact that if you take a look at the create function within our serializer, we are saving the products after extracting the stock data. We are saving the product without the stock data, and then we are returning that. If you remember, we're returning that. So in our view here, we return that, and we then send that data without the stock information, or we try to send that back to the client through our serializer. Now, of course, that needs to be deserialized or passed through the serializer to convert back into JSON before we send that back to the client. And what's happening here is that information, only the product information, that is trying to be deserialized or serialized in preparation to send back to the client. And of course, that information doesn't include the stock data because that was obviously removed at some point. So we need some way of telling Django DRF what this data is when we pass it back to the client. Just a quick reminder, we're not going to change write only here. So we're going to utilize this purely for saving data, and then we're going to override the ability to add additional information before we then go ahead and send that data back to the client. Now, there will be a few different approaches here, but I wanted to introduce two representation method. This is going to allow us to customize how model instances are serialized. So we're going to, within the two representation method, override or create a way of extracting, the data from the stock management table related to the product we have just inserted into the database, so that when we return back the data to the client, it will be serialized correctly to include the stock data. So essentially, we're going to supply the value for this when we serialize in preparation to send that data back to the client. Now, to fully understand this will require a deeper understanding of object-oriented programming, but I'll do my best for those who don't necessarily have experience with object-oriented programming. Right, so I've loaded up the new function, two representation method, and we start off with data equals super to representation instance. So this calls the base implementation of the two representation method from DRF's model serializer. Here we have super, the super function, which returns the default dictionary representation of the product instance. So for example, the fields defined in the serializer such as ID, name, price, and so on. So essentially we're returning this here, and that is going to be the starting point for our response. And then we can go ahead and add or modify to it. So the next task is for us to actually get the stock information, so fetch it from the database. So here we're going to use stock management table. We're going to use the default manager, so it provides us the tools such as filter, which we would discuss later in this course. So this is a way of filtering data or collecting data from the database and filtering that so that we only return what we need. So in this case, product, that's a reference to the product field in the stock management table at this point, because we're querying this table. We want that to return only the record where the product in a record equals the instance. So we're passing this instance in, and that's the product instance that we're sending back. So at this point, remember, we're sending back data. We're here in the response, and we're sending back at this point, remember, only the product information. We're trying to add that additional stock information so that we can send that back also to the client. Right, so we have that now. We use first as well, so we only return one item. So at this point, we've now queried the stock management table so that we only return the stock management data related to the product that we've just inserted into the database. Right, so we now have that stock instance, and now we need to add it so that we can then return that data back to the client. So the third step is to add the stock data. So here, if there is relevant stock data, which there should be, then we're going to grab the data. So we add the serialized stock data to the data dictionary under the key stock data. If it didn't exist, well, we would just return none. But in our case, the stock data should always be there for us to insert. So we have now added that now to the data that we're going to send back to the client. And then finally, we return data. So that now includes all the data, including the stock data, now back to the client. Right, so let's see this in action now. So let's load up some data. And in our product stock insert endpoint, quantity 9. So we can see and view this in our database. And yeah, that should be pretty much it. So let's go ahead and execute. So this time, in addition to the stock information, we now have, in addition to the product information that was returned to the client, this is what's being returned to the client. We are also now returning to the client the stock data. Just to confirm, that was 9 of these new product that we just entered into the database. And you can double check that by looking at the last record in the database. So looks like, yeah, the last record in the stock management table was the record we've just inserted. We inserted 9 products. Okay, so there's an example of inserting into multiple tables using nested serializer. And we have also seen how to customize the deserialization of the data returning back to the client.